Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let's just take a brief poll. How many were not here yesterday at lunchtime? Well, I feel sorry for you because I'm not going to repeat my lecture of yesterday, but you can probably catch up on YouTube. But what we're really talking about is the whole question, is God a delusion in this 21st century? Is it of any more relevance, or is it necessary, or is it totally redundant to believe in God? And I argued yesterday that actually, as a scientist, I owe my science to Christianity, which may have surprised some of you, because faith in God as a rational creator is the foundation for contemporary science. And I then began to investigate the reasons why it is that Isaac Newton believed in God and Stephen Hawking doesn't. And I argued that it has to do with confusion about two things. One, the nature of God, and two, the nature of explanation, including scientific explanation. And I'm going to have to, in a sense, regard those things as read, because I want to start today by coming to a very common argument which is at the heart of the book, The God Delusion, which surprised me greatly. And that is, it is pointless to talk about God in any sense as creator, because if you do, logically, you will have to ask, who created God? Who created the creator? Then, of course, if you're interested in logic, you'll have to say, who created the creator that created the creator that, and so on, ad nauseam, and the thing is absurd, so let's forget it. Now, we need to investigate that, because serious people take that as an argument. Who created the creator? So I want to do a little bit of logical analysis on this question. If I say to you, who or what created X? What does that question presuppose? It obviously presupposes that X was created. So if you ask the question, who created God, you're presupposing that God was created. If he wasn't, the question is irrelevant. And that's the heart of the issue. You see, let me put it this way. If Richard Dawkins had written a book called The Created God's Delusion, nobody would have bought it or even read it, because we know that created gods are a delusion. That's the whole point of the Freudian argument that I discussed yesterday. So who created the creator actually sounds very impressive, but it's empty, because it only refers to a created creator. And the God of the Bible, the central thing about him is he is uncreated, he is eternal. And so Dawkins' question doesn't even address it. The second point to be made about it is there's a sting in the tail. And when I discussed it with Richard Dawkins, as you can see in YouTube, I said this question, of course, is an interesting one, because you believe the universe created you. So let me ask you your question. Who created your creator? I've waited 8 years to get an answer to that. I haven't had it yet. There's a sting in the tail. But the third point to be made about it is that it raises a philosophical issue. What we're really talking about here when we ask the question is the nature of ultimate reality. Is there an ultimate reality? Or is it like the onion? You peel off layer after layer after layer, and you never get anywhere. And what I find in general is that both I and the people who oppose me do believe in an ultimate reality, a place where the buck stops, so to speak. For me, that is, of course, God. He is, by definition, the ultimate reality. He is eternal. For many of my atheist friends, the ultimate reality is the universe, mass, energy, or the multiverse. The buck does stop somewhere. And so the question is not, is there an ultimate reality, but which claim for ultimate reality is true? So this question, who created the creator, which I used to get a lot in Russia when I was in Siberia in the Academy of Sciences, I was very surprised to find it coming from a British academic. It's an old schoolboy question. When I was at school, this was a question. I never thought I'd ever meet it at the level of serious academia. Now, it leads me to another thing. I was looking at the posters strung up along, and they were very informative as to what I should speak about. And I noticed one of them really caught my eye, and it said, "Do we use faith when we lack evidence?" Now that brings me to another fog issue. Yesterday I talked about fog generators, the various misapprehensions, confusions that generate intellectual fog in the minds of people. And one of the great confusions today is, what do we mean when we talk about faith? Yesterday's confusion was, what do we mean when we talk about explanation? Today's is, what do we mean when we talk about faith? Because the poster says it all. And very often, some of my scientific colleagues who ought to know better say, you know, I believe in rationality, I believe in reason, you believe in faith. But he's just made a statement of faith. He believes in reason. Isn't that interesting? And yet, the concept of faith has been redefined subtly in the last while. What does faith mean? Well, faith in English comes from the Latin fides, from which we get fidelity, trustworthiness. And trust, when you raise the question of trust, why do you trust this person and not that? You immediately go to think of reasons why you trust this person and not that. So the central concept of faith, do you have faith in the banks? Well, that's why the financial crisis happened, isn't it? People had trust, but there was no evidence for it. And so the financial markets froze, and they didn't get going again until there was an evidence base built up. Everybody understands what evidence-based trust means. But what has happened is this, that the new atheists have cleverly, for many people, subtly redefined faith. And for them, faith is what I and most other people would call blind faith. That is, shut your eyes, take a great leap of faith, and don't worry about evidence or anything like that. And Richard Dawkins rightly says in his book that blind faith is dangerous. It is very dangerous. It can be, as the world has seen in relatively recent history. So, the very important thing is to separate in our minds blind faith with genuine faith that is evidence-based. Now, at this point, other religions must, of course, speak for themselves. I want to speak as a Christian. And my question to my own faith in God is it evidence-based or not? Does it claim to be evidence-based? And the answer to that is a resounding yes. Because take just, for example, one illustration of this, and that is the fourth gospel, the Gospel of John, a brilliantly written book. If you've never read it as an adult, start reading it and ask your questions. Because after detailing various profound incidents in the life and teaching of Jesus, he makes this summary statement. He said, you know, Jesus did many other things that are not written in this book, but these are written in order that you might believe. These are written that you might believe. Here's the evidence. I've listed all these signs, these indicators of the truth of Jesus' claim. These are written that you might believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God. And more than that, that believing you might have life in his name. So Christianity claims to be evidence-based. That's a very important thing. We must listen to what Christianity says before we dismiss it. That's the rational thing to do. So I stand here as a Christian because I believe there's an evidence base. So faith is based on evidence, okay? It's like with my wife. You see, we need to realize in this debate that God is not a theory. There are many theories about God, but God is actually a person. And so when we're thinking about belief in God, we're thinking not simply about accepting a certain group of theories about God, but we're thinking about trusting a person. Now, you know who you trust and who you don't trust. Everybody in this room knows that. And sometimes we get very disappointed, don't we, when somebody we trusted lets us down. and we get very disappointed indeed. That happens all the time. But the point is, we are sensitive to evidence. Children are sensitive to evidence about who they can trust and who they can't trust. So the ideas of trusting a person, and we raise the question, on what basis do we trust that person? So the first point I'm making is Christianity claims to be an evidence-based faith. Now, the idea that I have faith and a scientist uses reason is sheer nonsense. Partly for the reason I've just said, because the man that says, or the woman that says he or she trusts in reason, that is where their faith is placed. Now, what I want to try to get across to you today, ladies and gentlemen, is this: that all of you, without exception, in this university, are faith-based. And the main thing you have faith in is the capacity of the human mind to understand the subject you're studying. Isn't that so? No, I see some doubters around. Isn't it interesting? You all believe that information, the world, is accessible to study by the human mind. You wouldn't do any science. You wouldn't study anything if you didn't believe that. But now I want to raise the question, why do you believe that? Why do you believe, as I believe, that science can be done? Now, I have lots of fun with this, you see, because in Oxford it gets boring from time to time, believe it or not, in the common room. So I like to have little things I drop into the conversation. So I say to my friends, I say, tell me, what do you do science with? They say, well, I work in a laboratory. No, I don't mean that. What do you do it with in you? Oh, my mind. Oh, well, some people say, not my mind, my brain. Because after all, there's no transcendence, there's no mind. It's just your brain. You are your brain, as a recent book claims. Oh, I said that. That's very interesting. So you do your science with your brain, which is a physical object. Yes, that's what I do. Now, tell me about this brain that you do science with. Now, don't give me the long story. Give me the short story. What's the most compressed version of the story of your brain? Well, as somebody put it, well, the brain, what is it? It's a lump of meat that's the end product of a mindless, unguided process that did not foresee its existence. And I listen to that and I say, and you trust it? It's odd, isn't it? I find it fascinating, ladies and gentlemen. If you knew your computer was the end product of a mindless, unguided process, you wouldn't trust it for a second, would you? Now, here is one of the great ironies of the contemporary reductionist interpretation of reality. That the thing that is most trusted to give us results has no basis whatsoever for trusting it with the philosophies that it itself produces. That's a very interesting thing. It has a big history, you know. And this might surprise some of you, though not all. It actually goes back to Charles Darwin. Let me quote to you something from Darwin that's not often quoted. It's called Darwin's doubt. With me, the horrid doubt always arises, whether the convictions of man's mind, which has been developed from the mind of the lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? Now, the interest of that is that from a trickle that has now become a stream within philosophy of questioning, not simply coming from people like me who hold the Christian worldview, but from people who hold the atheist worldview. Just listen to one or two of the leading intellectuals of today commenting on this. First of all, I'll cite John Gray, Professor Emeritus of the History of European Thought in London. Modern humanism, he says, is the faith, now notice the word, that through science humankind can know the truth and so be free. But if Darwin's theory of natural selection is true, this is impossible. The human mind serves evolutionary success, not truth. Now, this is based on a reductionist philosophy. Let me give you Francis Crick's take on that. Talking about you and your mind and so on. You, your joys, your sorrows, your memories, your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. That's his astonishing hypothesis. He wrote a book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. Mind you, subtly in the middle of the book, he changes his hypothesis. And he says, you are largely, and of course he gives the whole game away. But it's very interesting to analyze that. That's what we call reductionism. You are nothing but the movement of molecules and elementary particles in your brain and so on. Nothing but is the characteristic of reductionism. And there are many people who will point out, and this is Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, who taught me quantum physics at Cambridge years ago. This program is ultimately suicidal. If Crick's thesis were true, we could never know it. For not only does it relegate our experiences of beauty, moral obligation, and religious encounter to the epiphenomenal scrap heap, it also destroys rationality. Thought is replaced by electrochemical neural events. Two such events cannot confront each other in rational discourse. They are neither right nor wrong. They simply happen. The very assertions of the reductionist himself are nothing but blips in the neural network of his brain. The world of rational discourse dissolves into the absurd chatter of firing synapses. Quite frankly, that cannot be right, and none of us believes it to be so. So what is Polkinghorne saying here? He's saying that if you take Crick's thesis, and remember Crick won the Nobel Prize. If you take Crick's thesis, you destroy the very rationality on which science is based. Now, that is being taken up increasingly by brilliant philosophers. I'm going to cite two. First of all, Alvin Plantinga, who's a Christian and rates at the world level in Notre Dame. He writes this: if Dawkins is right that we are the product of mindless, unguided natural processes, then he has given us strong reason to doubt the reliability of human cognitive faculties, and therefore inevitably to doubt the validity of any belief that they produce, including Dawkins' own science and his atheism. Now listen to this statement. This is fascinating. Dawkins' biology and his belief, faith in naturalism, would therefore appear to be at war with each other in a conflict that has nothing at all to do with God. Now come to the atheist side. Thomas Nagel is one of the leading, if not the leading, philosophers in North America at the moment. And he wrote an explosive book, explosive in its title, and if you look it up in cyberspace, you'll see the colossal row that he's generated. Let me give you the title. It's called Mind and Cosmos. Well, that's pretty innocent. But the subtitle is not innocent. Why the neo-Darwinian view of the world is almost certainly false. Now, this is an atheist writing. And his argument is that reductionism has worked very well in the physical sciences to a certain extent, but what we've forgotten, completely forgotten, is the mind that's doing the science. And if you apply reductionism to that, you destroy the basis for faith and rationality. In other words, you undermine the rational basis for science itself. But let him speak rather than me. If the mental, he says, is not merely physical, it cannot be fully explained by physical science. Evolutionary naturalism implies that we shouldn't take any of our convictions seriously, including the scientific world picture on which evolutionary naturalism itself depends. Now, what am I saying here? I'm saying, ladies and gentlemen, something very simple. My main reason for rejecting atheism is not because I'm a Christian at all. It's because I'm a scientist. I believe in the capacity, albeit limited, of the human mind to understand the universe. I believe in rationality, but I have a rational basis for believing it. And I'm back to Isaac Newton. How did modern science start? As I said yesterday, it started, men became scientific. Why? Because they expected law of nature. Why? Because they believed in the lawgiver. That's the rational base. Atheism simply removes it and asks you to take a blind leap of faith where there's no evidence, because the theory they're producing with their brain undermines any trust that that theory could possibly be true, because the apparatus that's delivering it to you is suspect in its generation. I take that as a very, very serious point indeed, and I'm delighted to see at this stage in history philosophers of all kinds, not just Christians like me or theists, but atheists taking it seriously. We're moving into the age where we're beginning to realize something very fascinating that we ought to have thought about long ago. You see, the dominant philosophy in our universities in the West tends to be materialistic, naturalistic. This universe is all that there is, and so on and so forth. But, ladies and gentlemen, that cannot quite be true, can it? Because, you see, we've lived to an age where we realize that information, this is the information age, that information is crucial. And information, whatever it is, and it's difficult to define, is not physical, it's not material. And materialism ends when we begin to realize that one of the fundamental concepts of physics is immaterial. Information is usually involves material for its expression, but the information you see up there is not itself material. And here's the great irony, and I'm pleased to have lived to see it, that people working away on materialistic assumptions are suddenly beginning to realize, half a minute, there's a semiotic dimension to life. Now, I want to now probe in a little stage further to what I started yesterday on the nature of explanation. Because we're often told at school and alas in university that the only kind of valid explanation is from the simple to the complex. You've got that idea, haven't you? You reduce something complex to simple elements and you put them together. And the methodological reductionistic method that all of us use, all of us, including me, is that when we've got a big problem, we separate it into little problems, try and solve the little problems, and get insight on the big ones. That's called methodological reductionism. Now, Richard Dawkins and the rest of the new atheists are very strong on this. Crick, as you heard, who is one of the world's leading scientists, he is reductionist to the core. And Dawkins echoes him and says, my task is to explain life and elephants and so on in terms of physics and chemistry. Well, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work in one specific area. Because, well, let me go back to where I started. Who created the creator? There's another objection that I get raised to me which is related to that. And that is this, that God is in no sense an explanation for anything, because by definition, God is more complex than the thing you're explaining. So he's not an explanation at all. And I thought that was very amusing when I read it with Richard Dawkins, and I put it to him that I pick up a book called The God Delusion. It's pretty complex. It's got about 400 pages in it. And then I ask, what about its origin? And I discover its origin is in the infinitely more complex mind of Richard Dawkins, so I dismiss that completely. Because that explanation is more complex than the thing that we're explaining. And that is very important, ladies and gentlemen. The one area where explanation tends to be more complex than the thing you're explaining is where there's a semiotic, a linguistic, a semantic dimension. Let me illustrate that very simply. If I were in some sort of cave system in China, and we're looking at scratches and marks in the wall, and I'm with a Chinese archaeologist, and we're going through, and we see something like that scratched on the wall, and I just walk straight past it. But the archaeologist stops and she says, human intelligence. And I say, don't be so stupid. I mean, 2 scratches. And you say human intelligence. Don't be ridiculous. I'm thinking of the North Oxford argument, you see. Dawkins' argument that your explanation, putting human intelligence onto that, is absurd because this is much more complex than that. I think the archaeologists would have every right to say to me, have you never studied Chinese? Because that is the Chinese symbol run, which means a human being. It's semiotic. It carries meaning. And because it carries meaning, I know that the only explanation that makes sense of that is infinitely more complicated than those 2 scratches. It's a human mind. And please, ladies and gentlemen, thinking of what I was saying yesterday, this is not a mind of the gaps. It's the only solution to semiotics that makes sense. Now, the interest increases, and I put this to many people, many academic people, because let's change the scene just a little bit and change the kind of language used. You may recognize this. And so on for 3.5 times 10 to the 9 letters, the human genome. Yes? And you'll notice these letters, C, G, A, and T, they're codons. Have you ever had a look at that word, codon? Why is it used? Why do we use computer speak in genetics? Because some mathematicians like John Maynard Smith managed, against a lot of objection, to point out that actually we're dealing with a colossally complicated database here. And the codons code for something. They code for the proteins, so there's a semiotic dimension to this. Now, this is what I put to my colleagues sometimes. You look at those 2 scratches, and you immediately postulate intelligence. Why? Because there's a semiotic dimension. You look at DNA, and what do? You say chance and the laws of nature. Really? Is that all there is to it? And the irony of it, ladies and gentlemen, as a scientist now, to me, is that we have lived to discover the longest word that's ever been discovered in any language. Now, you only have to see the letters of your name written in the beach. Susie. 4 letters. And immediately you know that intelligence has been active. The biblical claim is that God is obvious in creation, ladies and gentlemen. I think he's utterly obvious. He's made himself known in every one of the 10 trillion cells that comprises you. And listen now to the biblical worldview, zeroing in on this. It doesn't say in the beginning was mass energy. No, it says in the beginning was the Word. Isn't that fascinating? In the age of information, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things came to be through him. And here is the New Testament answering Dawkins' question. Because the Greeks were fascinated by existence. These are existence statements. They were interested in things that came to be, like you and me, like stars. And they were interested whether there was anything that existed that never came to be. In the beginning, the Word already was. That's an existence statement. The Word never came to be. The Word is eternal. The universe came to be. But notice the priority. The Bible says relatively little about creation, but what it says is utterly fascinating and up to date. I remember discussing it with an astrophysicist, and he'd just come back from America, and he said to me, "You don't believe this stuff, do you? About God and the Bible and creation." Well, I said, "I don't know." Well, he said, he threw me a chalk. He said, "Prove it to me." So I caught the chalk, and I wrote on his backboard. I might as well do it for you. since you're nice people. You see, this is what I wrote on his blackboard. And God said. And he roared with laughter. He's a world-famous astrophysicist for you. So underneath this I wrote, in the beginning was the Word. He said, what's that? Well, I said, it's a Greek word actually. It's logos, from which we get logic. And it means command, code, information. He said, what did you say? I said, you heard me. He said, did you use the word information? I said, yes. He said, you're not telling me that the Bible's got the concept of information, are you? I said, what does it look like? And then he said, does Sir Fred Hoyle know this? And I said, I don't know. Well, he said, we better tell him. And we did, but that's another story. Ladies and gentlemen, what I want to submit to you as we come now close to question time is the biblical analysis is brilliant. And it's absolutely spot on. Because in all the statements, practically, about creation, it talks about God speaking. And God said, in the beginning was the Word. By faith we understand that the worlds were made by the Word of God. This universe and you are speech acts. And you carry the code. All of you carry the code. That's evidence of something non-material. So we don't need to go to Christianity or the Bible to start with to have evidence of immateriality. We can go to information and we can go to human rationality. You see, it's very interesting. You know, sometimes people say to me, you say this because you're an Irishman. Have you ever heard that kind of logic? You say this because you're a woman, you say this because you're... But have you ever thought about what that means? You see, many people might react to me if they knew that my parents from Ireland were Christians and my grandparents. Well, of course you say this because you're an Irishman. And what they mean is, because I can give you a causal reason you're an Irishman, therefore what you say has no meaning. That's the argument. But have a moment, thought. If you're a materialist, what you're trying to do, like Crick, is to explain everything in terms of an unbroken chain of cause and effect back to original material. In other words, you're undermining, that very use of that argument shows that you're undermining the concept of rationality straight away. So what am I saying? I'm saying something that C.S. Lewis tried to point out about 40 years ago in his book on miracles, where he points out that the first level evidence that there is a supernature is your rationality. That's the fascinating thing. Because if you can explain your rationality solely in material terms, you've destroyed it. In other words, the very motivation for doing science, and we can now see this at a much deeper level, and I've written about this in a couple of my books, is that rationality stands as evidence for the existence of God. Now, I'm going to make a final point here, and then we're going to have a few questions, because one of the fascinating things that science has led to now in its results is that the universe had a beginning. That evidence came in the 1960s when I was a student at Cambridge, and it was resisted by the scientific establishment because they didn't like its resonance with the Bible, which was interesting that the major scientific advance of the 1960s was resisted because it postulated a beginning, and that was too much convergent with the Bible. But now, of course, it's set itself through. But it's got much more interesting in recent days, because you see, we now discover, and the scientists tell us, the physicists, and it's fascinating, that the universe started with nothing. And that now becomes extremely interesting. If you don't believe in God, how did the universe start? Well, it started with nothing. How do you get something from nothing? And there's a whole plethora of books written on that. And they're very interesting to read. Listen to Hawking's argument in his major book. Here's the heart of it. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will generate itself from nothing. What? Let's run that past me again. Because there is a law of gravity, because there is something, the universe will generate itself from nothing. Flat contradiction number one. It's far worse than that, actually. Because there is a law of gravity, not because there is gravity. But what would a law of gravity mean if there's no gravity? And here we're hinting at another fog confusion that many leading scientists, peace be to them, believe that laws can create, but laws can't create anything. And Hawking, in his book, the very first law he gives, the simple one, the sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. Well, that's a good law, but you will notice it didn't create the sun, nor the east, nor the west. It describes what's there. It doesn't create anything. And you can see this confusion at the top levels of science. I once had a chat with Peter Atkins, my colleague, and I bet the chemists here know all about his books. They sell in millions. And I said, Peter, what do you think created the universe? And he said, mathematics. So I'm afraid I reacted rather too rapidly, and I laughed. And he said, why are you laughing? We hadn't met before, you see. I said, Peter, you know, that's about the silliest thing I've ever heard in my life. I said, I happen to be a mathematician. Tell me, I said, let me make it simple for you. 1 + 1 = 2. Did that ever put £2 in your pocket? You see, ladies and gentlemen, it is true, isn't it, that the financial crisis came about precisely because people believed mathematics could create money. It's called creative accounting. You've heard of it. And we get confused that laws create. They don't. Newton's laws of motion never moved a billiard ball in the history of the universe. People with cues do that. The laws describe what happens. It's a profound mistake, and Hawking's making it, but it's even worse than that. The universe can create itself from nothing. Well, if I say X creates Y, what does that mean? Well, roughly speaking, it means if you've got X, you'll get Y. If I say X creates X, what does that mean? Well, if you've got X, you'll get X. And what does that mean? It means that nonsense remains nonsense, no matter who's talking it, including high-powered scientists. When I read that, I was utterly astonished. Here's one of the world's leading scientists talking triple-leveled nonsense. Well, listen to Lawrence Krauss, one of the world's leading astrophysicists. How do you get a universe from nothing? Well, you change the definition of nothing. Simple as that. Listen to him. Because, and this is a direct quote from his book, A Universe from Nothing, because something is physical, nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. What? Because something is physical. Nothing must be physical, especially if you define it as the absence of something. Ladies and gentlemen, we laugh, but I laugh. Such nonsense deserves laughter. It's absurd. Why are they going to such extremes? The absurdity is because they will not face the God question. Because, of course, the universe doesn't come from nothing. It's created by an intelligent, pre-existent, eternal God. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the answer. And the amusing thing from my point of view is that astrophysics has brilliantly painted itself into a corner from which it cannot get out. Because it says there was a beginning to space-time. And so they've changed the definition of nothing. Nothing turns out to be a quantum vacuum and all the rest of it. So when I was at MIT last year or the year before, I was debating Alan Guth, who, as many of you will know, is the father of the theory of inflation, a brilliant cosmologist. And I couldn't resist the opportunity in front of 100 professors at MIT and Harvard, saying to Alan, there's a big confusion out there about nothing. He said, is there? I said, yes, there is. I said, and I want you to tell me, when you astrophysicists talk about nothing in connection with the origin of the universe, you do not mean nothing in the accepted normal sense of absence of anything. You know, if I go down into Cape Town and I meet nobody, it doesn't mean I meet somebody called nobody. It means I didn't meet anybody. Have you got that? And what he said was, of course we don't. We're talking about a quantum vacuum. But this is disingenuous, ladies and gentlemen. They are failing to do what they claim to do. And book after book after book is determined to get a get a universe from nothing without the creator. But you see, the universe is not neutral. For centuries you could have got away with that because they believed the universe was eternal. And you didn't have the problem. Now we've got the problem. And the problem has arisen out of good science, mainstream science. There was a beginning. And incidentally, if we'd taken the Bible more seriously before we did, we could have predicted that we would find evidence that there was a beginning. Because the Bible's been saying it for thousands of years. But Aristotle took precedence with his eternal universe. So I'm going to stop there. But these are just some indicators, ladies and gentlemen, why I believe that nature is not neutral. The very fact we can do science points to an intelligence behind the universe. The very constitution of our genetic nature points to that. Our very rationality points to transcendence. And the concept of information that scientists now regard as fundamental is an immaterial notion. So I'm afraid I would want to suggest to you that atheism doesn't only shoot itself in the foot, that's painful. It shoots itself in the brain, and that's fatal. Thank you very much. Okay. We got a few minutes for questions. I collect a few questions and I'll answer them. You first and then you. Just shout it out loud. Stand up and let's hear you. And make it brief because we've very little time. Yes, please. Okay, thank you. Very precise. Yes, please. Yes. Oh, it's fascinating and incorrect, I suspect. But there we are. I'll come back to it in a moment. 3. Number 3, yes, a lady there. They believe the Bible's not true, but it's made up. Okay. I'm going to stick with that because we've got very limited time. Max Tegmark at Princeton, I was due to debate him, and I was very disappointed I didn't. He's the father, really, of the multiverse hypothesis. And he came out with the idea, and I can't explain that to those of you who don't know about a multiverse, in pace requiescat. Just sleep on it, don't worry about it. His idea is that there's either a multiverse or a creator. And that's a profound philosophical mistake, as many people have pointed out. God can create as many universes as he likes. From a theoretical perspective, the notion of a multiverse doesn't contradict theism. And in fact, you meet people like Don Page, who worked with Stephen Hawking and published 7 or 8 papers. Read Don Page, because he's a Christian and a believer in the multiverse. So that's all I can say about that. The second point is that people reject the Bible, and what do we do about that? Well, what we do is what I've begun to do, is to see stepwise how much sense the Bible makes. In the beginning, God. It postulates a beginning. That was unheard of for centuries. In the scientific world, everybody believed in an eternal universe. There wasn't a beginning. The Bible got it right. And when I put that to Richard Dawkins, he says, big deal, big deal. You have 50% chance of getting it right. Otherwise, there was either a beginning or there wasn't. I said, Richard, you're aware, as I do, that the thing wasn't settled by tossing a coin. It took enormous scientific pressure coming from people like Penzias, Nobel Prize winners, Hubble, the expansion of space, the redshift, and above all the microwave background, to force people to think that they may have been wrong. It wasn't settled on the toss of a coin, but the Bible has stated it for centuries. So we can see the Bible is right about the beginning. Now, when the people say that the Bible's likely to be wrong, they're often, in this context, referring to the creation story. I was asked a question about it yesterday, so I'm not going to repeat my answer. If you're interested in that, I've written a book about it called 7 Days That Divide the World. But the point is that the Bible takes risks because it's geared into history. For instance, the central claim of Christianity and why I'm here is because I believe as a matter of history that Jesus rose from the dead. Now, many of my scientific colleagues say, but that's absurd. I mean, that's their main objection, actually, and I haven't even dealt with it. So let me say 2 words about it. They say, look, we know the laws of nature now. And as David Hume said long ago, he said, the laws of nature cannot be broken. You're claiming Jesus rose from the dead. That's a break in the laws of nature. Forget it. But that's another fog. It's a confusion between laws of nature and laws of the land. Let's suppose I'm staying in a hotel in Cape Town. Tonight I put in my drawer 100 rand. Tomorrow night 100 rand. That's 200 rand. Is that right? The next morning I find 50 rand. What's been broken? The laws of arithmetic or the laws of South Africa? Why are you laughing? You're laughing. I'll tell you why you're laughing. Because you see the difference between a mathematical law and the laws of the state. We confuse the 2 concepts. We don't confuse them there. Now, how do you know that the laws of South Africa have been broken? You know it because the laws of arithmetic haven't been broken. And therefore you know, on the basis of your knowledge of the laws of arithmetic, that somebody has put their hand in from outside and taken the money out. You thought your drawer was a closed system. It turned out not to be. And ladies and gentlemen, at the deeper level, many of my colleagues believe this universe is a closed system. You see, people like me who believe that Jesus rose from the dead are not claiming that he rose from the dead by some natural processes going on in the grave 5 minutes before it happened. No, what we're claiming is this universe is not a closed system, and God, through his energy and power, can raise Jesus from the dead. That doesn't break any laws. Indeed, if you didn't know the law that normally dead bodies remain dead, you wouldn't be surprised at a resurrection, would you? You have to know the norm to recognize that something special has happened. And then you can ask the question, why? But the laws of nature don't prohibit it happening. You see, we live in a universe where God created the universe with its regularities, but he's not a prisoner of them, as if they were laws of the state. They simply describe what normally happens. They don't prevent him putting a hand in. Now, the last question was, what about other religions? Well, what about them? It's a most important question. And again, I've got to stop. I've been told there's this sign is very dangerous. So, have a look at my book, Gunning for God. But my basic point is this. How do you decide? I decide these things in the way I decide everything else, on the basis of evidence. For instance, talk about the resurrection of Jesus. My Jewish friends, and I have many of them, believe that Jesus died and did not rise. My Muslim friends, and I have plenty of those, believe he didn't die. I believe he both died and rose. Now, anybody can see that all of those 3 things cannot be simultaneously true. They're not all true. And so you've got to decide on the basis of evidence. Now, what that evidence is, again, I've written extensively on it. And if you're interested in a much more detailed and nuanced approach to other religions, my final point is this. Leave Christianity out. Islam will never agree with Hinduism on the number of gods there are. And we can have a really good public debate if we remember one thing. That every man or woman, whoever they are, whether they believe in God or not, whether they're in this religion or that or none at all, every one of them has infinite value because they're made in the image of God. Once we get that straight, then we can talk. But we can't now, so thank you very much.